a sound mind and old enough, being a sound mind and old enough, I'm going to try to give a little history here. I'm not a historian, I'm a preacher, but still, I think I can bring some things out that I've found that might be of interest to you. You might ask the question, well, why do you try to look back and see when things began as far as the church is concerned? Well, it's called roots. I don't know whether you've noticed it or not, but most children that are adopted, once they find out they've been adopted, they begin to search for their real parents, if they're still alive. You ask why? I don't know. I think it's innate. I think it's just a question you got to answer. You want to know, well, who were my parents? What were they like? I think I'd be the same way. That's because roots mean something. The Bible genealogies are in the scriptures, give the Israelites roots all the way back to the beginning, Adam and Eve. That was important to them. You may have traced, since we got computers now, you may be one of these people that's tried to trace your genealogy of your family. You want to see how far back you can go. I haven't done that. David's done that some. I have not. But I did have our daughter, Vicki and Thomas, who just got back from being in Ireland on a vacation. She brought me back the Flannagan crest. Back in Ireland, the country is made up of clans mostly, and each clan had a crest. It's a kind of an ornamental type of configuration, sometimes a picture of an animal or a person or a shield or something, and it was called a family crest. And it usually has an inscription across it. And ours had an inscription across it in Latin. I couldn't tell you what it said, except it meant we fought and we conquered. And had a history of the Flannagan people going back to the 11th century and even beyond that. And I found it real interesting. It just, felt kind of personal about it, to realize there's all those Flannagans back there. I hadn't thought about it. I need to go over there and check, see if I inherited any land over there or anything. I doubt that. Actually, Flannagans were known for the liquor industry, so maybe that's why I'm a preacher, I don't know. Well, you've heard the expression, history repeats itself, and that kind of bears out things that we need to learn. The Bible is full of Bible history. That's the Old Testament, as Eric talked on this morning, is just a book of history of God dealing with his people, and you learn through the dealings that God, in dealings with these people, what God is like. That's how you learn about God. Well, in the same way, we find that you say, well, that was then, though, but history repeats. Every generation just about like the generation before. Now, it may be more productive, it may be in a different industrial age, so to speak, but in overall, life is the same one generation next to the other. That's why the Bible is so applicable for every generation. So what was written in the Old Testament back in those days fits your life and mine very down to a T. Even law, the laws we have in our land today, when we obey them and carry them out, came from the old Bible, Old Testament. We find then that one of the big problems that I read, I just kind of glanced through the concordance, and I looked up the word forgotten. I want to see how people in Israel forgot their roots. I found it talks about forgetting God. How did the country go after that? They went down. They forgot the law. How did they go? They went down. They forgot the Sabbath. Where did they go? Down. And as we pointed out this morning, a Pharaoh rose up in 200 years now, just 200 years, a Pharaoh rose up that did not know Joseph. Now, how could that be? Those Israelite people were multiplying and knew who they were. All he had to do was check their background and would have known of Joseph, and you'd think some of the stories of Joseph and his escapades of saving all the nations round about him would have filtered down through the years. I'd say that Pharaoh didn't want to know. He was Pharaoh, and he didn't want to even think about anybody else being a Pharaoh. He's just interested in himself. What did he forget? He forgot his roots, and he had a bad ending as well. I was going through our directory. This one was held up in production while we moved here. They were being printed, and they said, we're going to hold it up to get your picture, and Dolores is in there, and we did. You look in there, you'll see a couple of people you may not recognize, and that's Dolores and me. I went through this directory a while ago, just before I took my nap. I found that out of all the people, there's about 120 members here at that time. I listened to this book here. 88 had moved from here. 116 have died. And 20 are still here. And I thought that's kind of interesting. And you may have to look around to find out who they are, but Sidonia and Charlie were here. But a few of us, and Dolores and I were here, so there's a few of us, about 20 people were here when we moved here, after we moved here. I'm going to read a little bit because this is history, and I'll try not to bore you. I think you'll find it interesting. This is an article that some of you might have read and may not. Came out in a gospel paper. I got some of this from Harold. Harold is he's got files over there that go back to Methuselah. I don't know how he keeps a garage full of files. He just, every time an article come out, he listed it in, he cut it out and put it in the file. And he came up with these for me, so I give him the credit for it. This was written to one of the gospel papers by Zelpha Sprague. Of course, those of you that know her that are older. And she wrote it in response to the writer of the paper wanted to hear about churches and their history. And if you do anything about it, to write into it. So she writes this letter, and I'll read it to you. I have thought for some time I would send you a history of the church in Lawton. Okay, I am the oldest member of the New Testament church here. My parents established a church when they moved here in 1906, a year before Oklahoma was made a state. I was 6 months old. My grandmother was a sister to the noted F.B. and F.D. Shrigley. Now, if you know anything about old preachers, Shrigley name will ring a bell to you. If not, they were brothers who were preachers and authors along with T.B. Larimore. I'm sure you've heard that name. The Church of Christ had never been heard of in Lawton when my family moved here. But Papa, who was John David Carter, and my three brothers would rent long planks and cement blocks from the lumberyard and make seats in the town park where an open-air meeting was held each summer. I remember those. Charlie and Sidonia, some of the older remember those. I went to several meetings where you sit on a plank. It's not very comfortable to sit on a 1 by 12 or 2 by 12, especially when bugs are flying around outside. It's always outside. So this was a common practice back in those days. The three brothers of Zelpha Sprague, we were trying to think. Some of you may remember, if you're old enough, that Ed Carter was an elder at Northwest Church. He ran a printing shop here in town. We did our printing through him. He is probably one of these three brothers. We weren't sure, but that's the only thing we can think of. And it's his daughter that Bob, the one that moved here first. Can't think of his first name. Last name. First preacher here. Well, what is his name? Wilson, Bob Wilson. Bob Wilson married Ed Carter's daughter. And that was his connection, how he got here to be the first preacher in Lawton. Give you a little time there. Papa would hire a preacher to come, a preacher and a singer to come and preach 2 to 3 weeks. They would stay at our house where our family of 9 were already crowded. I wonder who gave up their bed for the preacher. A few members were recruited by these meetings, but we still had worship service from house to house each Lord's Day. Once, Papa rented the Lutheran church building for services, but it wasn't successful because the Lutherans held their services there too, and it was confusing to the public. The church building was 2 miles from our home. I was 4 years old and can remember my family walking to worship services, Mama carrying one baby, Papa carrying the other baby, and me trudging along crying every step of the way. When I see members today who neglect attendance at worship, even though they have air-conditioned cars and padded pews at the building and so forth, I often think of the hardships and obstacles that my poor parents lived through to establish a church here. In 1918, during World War I, Lawton's population grew because of Fort Sill. being adjacent to the town. And many people came here during that time. Papa then secured permission for us to have worship at the county courthouse, as it was centrally located for strangers coming to town, and for the soldier boys. I was 13 years old by that time. It was then that my father and baby sister died with the awful flu epidemic that swept the U.S. Papa never saw a church building here to house the members, but his labors and perseverance proved to be the start of 7 congregations in this city. When I see the work of these congregations, I thank our Lord that my dear parents were the start of it all. Supposed to be another page of this. Okay, here it is. Mother was left with 6 children to raise, but the growth of the town had brought about 10 families of the church here to live. They pooled their money and built a small frame building, but Papa never lived to see it. I married a boy from the Christian church named Robert Sprague, whom I converted, and he stepped into my father's shoes and furthered the church from then on. He was responsible for helping each of the 7 congregations get started during our 54 years together. He was a businessman, a land developer, an author, and a preacher. He baptized many people and helped establish churches in surrounding small towns. Some of us older remember the Spriggs very well. Brother Spriggs was here when we moved here, and several years before he died. He was an influential man. He was a successful businessman. There was some controversy over some of the things he did. Of course, there's always anybody successful, somebody doesn't like you, you know. But I think you'll have to say in all fairness that he did a lot for the churches in Lawton. And though he might have been, some may have objected to the way he handled the church, worked in the church at 6th and Arlington, that's another story. I found a picture of the 6th and Arlington congregation. Harold had this. And I looked for Charlie and Sidonia in there. And then I got to looking, and barely, faintly, I could read is 1928, so they weren't in there. Mark, scratch that. That's for their time. But Charles and Sidonia came to us here from 6th and Arlington, as some others did as well. Now, to get a historic kind of chronological order, here are some things at times, some of these will be repeat, but things that happened and the dates on them. 1901, of course, was the opening of Oklahoma Territory. There were 2 families here named Lawsons and Gibsons. In 1906 was Indian Territory. 1907, Oklahoma became a state. You know, you get to think about these things. I always thought Oklahoma had been a state for 200 or 300 years, but it wasn't a state for any years before I was born. And a little less than that when Charlie was born. In 1912, 4 families, including the Carters, rented the Lutheran building we mentioned about a while ago for worship. That was 1912. In 1917 to 1920, they met in the county courthouse. There were 2 elders, Brother Carter and Brother Daniels. Was this Brother Daniels, the old Daniel that was here when I came here? You don't know? That's the only Daniels I know. He could have been. He's old enough to be him. In 1921, they met in a 24-foot by 39-foot building at 7th and E. There were 10 families and about 50 to 75 members at that time. In 1928, the 6th and Arlington Church started in a 50 by 50 stucco building with 125 members. They built a new building in 1957. 1932, the Black Brethren conducted a tent meeting at 2nd and Gore. That's 2nd Street where the flags fly down there, and 2nd Street and Gore, where like to the what? Yeah. Brother Marshall Keebo was the preacher. Of course, he was the one that went around at that time, famous preacher. They built a church building at 1st and Euclid in 1937. Then a second black congregation at 17th and McKinley started in 1948. And then the Rose Hill congregation, which was combining of the 2, started in 1982, built a new building. In 1945, 8th and Lee congregation started. on the southeast corner of the 8th Lee Street. The building, their building burned, and that was just before we came, I think, and was rebuilt in, no, that's not, I'm sorry. Then was rebuilt in 1947. The present building was built across the street on southeast corner in 1959. Their building now was built 1 year before we came here. In 1952, the Northwest Congregation started at 24th and Cash. In 1954, the University Church started, 28th and Cornell. 1963, the Western Hills Church started by the cooperation of other churches. 1965 and 66, the church at Sutherland Village started with some members from all congregations here. Now then, going back to the University Church. Now I'm reading what's really in your directory. You may not have ever read it, but if you have, you've forgotten it, so I'll read it again. The congregation had its first worship service on Sunday, June 6, 1954, in its new building at 28th and Cornell. And by the way, James Harvey, who was a deacon here, built this church building. If you go to Marlow, there's another one just like it, because it's built from the same plan. So you get in Marlow and you go by a church building, you may look at it, take a second look. I don't know what they've done to it since then, but it's the same plan as this one right here. At the first Sunday singing that afternoon, there were 335 present. Now that's before we expanded the building. So take out about 4 of those pews back there and think of 335 people in this building. A little crowded. What? Well, that's another story. They did. In the back windows back there, they had giant water coolers that were geared up that when I preached, my hair went back like that. I couldn't believe it when I came here. The air would come through blowing so fast that they couldn't hardly hear me speak over the microphone. It didn't last too long. It just wouldn't work that way. I guess they geared it up to try to cool us off because it was hot, and it wasn't much cooler with those air conditioners, I'll tell you, water coolers. But that's the way it was. And not only that, as you know, the door was right down this aisle, front door. The other buildings were not here. This was the back door. In the wintertime, the building was nice and warm. Somebody opened the front door. The back door would blow open, or somebody would open it to come in, and all of the heat would go whoosh. And then time the door was closed, you felt like it dropped 20 degrees in this building. It did that every time the door opened. The floor was tiled, so it was kind of cold anyway, and that was something hard to live with. To feel that air just go out. I mean, sometimes you didn't even open the door, you just blow it open. Open it out, the wind out of the northwest would blow this one open, and the heat would just evacuate. Those were the days. Makes me cold to think about it. The starting of the work was both planned. Let's see, the congregation received 30 of its members from 8th and Lee, some from the 6th of Darlington and Northwest congregations. Starting of the work was both planned and financed by 8th and Lee and with the fellowship of the other congregation. Brother Bill Reed and Robert Foster were the 2 elders. They were the elders when I moved here. Bob Wilkerson and I went to college together. Knew him in college, in Bible class. I can remember something about him, just to throw it in. In the class, it was a religious class. He was and another boy, the teacher wanted them to have a little debate. And one would be a Pentecostal, Bob would be a Pentecostal, and the other would be a Christian Church of Christ. And the one that was Church of Christ, because the other one believed that you could drink any deadly poison, it wouldn't hurt you, handed him a can of lye, said, "Here, drink, eat this." And I remember Bob Wilkerson took the can and threw it out the door and said, "Thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God." That's stored up here way back there in the back of my mind. I was about 22 years old then. So I did know Bob Wilkerson. I didn't know he was coming to church here, but I did know him. He was hired for the congregation for 2.5 years, and during his labors, the Bible chair at Cameron College was started. The following men have been directors of the Bible chair. Bob Wilson was first, and Jay Smith. These two were gone. Jay Smith had just moved when we came here, and Clyde Sloan was the director at that time. Eugene Bird, Doug Sykes came from Chickasha down this way, from Alex. Rollo Tinkler and I went to college as well together. He was a preacher at 6th in Arlington, and he left there and came here to be Bible chair director for a while. Then Bob Skelton, Neil Bedford, Marlon McWilliams, and then Larry Shelley. The Bible chair was an important work of this surrounding congregations of the Church of Christ, but Urban Renewal of Lawton bought the building used for another 20 years. It was up the street. They just built it, had just finished building it when we moved here in 1960. 20 years there, and then Urban Renewal took it for the college and rebuilt them here. New building was built behind the present structure on Cornell at a cost of $65,000. And the university elders make the difficult decision to end the Bible chair program as of November 1985, and that was done basically because the classes were taught for credit. They could get students to come and did pretty well, but the college cut that off. Students then wouldn't come over and take the classes, and so it deteriorated from there on. When Bob Wilson moved, Brother David Howell was employed as the local preacher for the congregation. During David's stay with the congregation, the present classroom building was completed. That's the building over yonder, not the in-between, providing 13 more classrooms and 2 offices. And David Howell left and was replaced by Brother L.D. Webb in July 1959. Weldon Flannagan and family moved to Lawton September 1960 to replace L.D. Webb as minister of the church. He and his wife Dolores have served from then until the present, a period of over 25 years. So this, you know when this was written. During that time, many changes and happenings have affected the church at 28th and Cornell. Its name was changed from 28th and Cornell. And it's called that because that's 28th Street and this is Cornell Street. But they changed the street to University Drive. So it was changed from 28th Cornell to College Church, so a few years of college, and then when it changed the street, well, it changed to University Drive Church of Christ. Since that time, more elders have been added and some have died. Charles Kelsey, Bill Prock, and Robbie Perry were added in 1962. Later in 65, Elmo Harper became an elder, followed by Don Markham in 1972 and Leroy Horn in 1978. Over the years, Robbie Perry and Robert Foster have died. Don Markham resigned because of the death of his wife. Of course, you know, since that time, Brian and James and who else? Somebody else, third one, have been added to the J.D. Brennan were added, and so you know where we are now. You know our present elders. The building program included addition of 2 classrooms, a nursery, and the new foyer by joining the 2 buildings together. One of the greatest things to this church building was that when we did enclose the 2 buildings, it gave us a foyer out here, which we didn't have. We had to meet up here. It stopped the cold wind from rushing in and taking out all the hot air. Gave us a nursery and class. We had windows at that time and then windows to a nursery back there. But then later, kind of renovated the auditorium. That's when all the paneling and the windows were covered up and the woodwork was added, and at that time wallpaper was on both ends of the building. It was a beautiful building. In fact, we had people that visited said it's the prettiest church building inside that they'd ever been in. Through the years, the university has helped supply members to begin 2 new congregations in Lawton, Western Hills on the west side, and Sullivan Village on the east side in 1965. That pretty well takes it through. I've got up here, if you want to see this directory, and here's a bulletin from 6th in Arlington, back when they began, picture of their building, and picture of Burton Coffin, who was the first preacher they had. 1 or 2 that shows our building before the center part was built, and one of it just the building itself by alone, and then when the building was added. That plus the 6th and Arlington picture that I have here that I'll leave up here for you to look at. I don't think you'll know anybody. There's one thing about this picture that kind of reminds me of my school pictures when I was about 10 or 11 years old. We all looked like we were part of the movie, what was it, Tobacco Road, with overalls and shirt tails hanging out, and tennis shoes. Looked like we was below poverty level, and probably were. That's kind of the way us 6 in Arlington people, of course, they got suits on, but they do look a little rustic. You may want to look at that. There's a picture or two of us up here. That's all I have. I know that's too short, but I just don't feel like preaching an hour, especially with ice cream waiting on me. But that's all I know. That's all I can find from Harold. You may know some things I don't know. Could add to this, but we're thankful, as is pointed out in the prayer, David had in the prayer, for the Spriggs and those families starting a church. Can you imagine being 2 families being responsible for 600-700 people in church in Lawton now, and indirectly? That's something to appreciate and to be thankful for. Now you kind of know where we came from as far as the churches here are concerned. What's the future of the church in Lawton? Only the Lord knows. We do know it's a fact that churches, not only churches of Christ, but denominational churches as well, have been going down somewhat. There's probably an explanation of that. I don't know fully what it is. I think it's worldliness for one thing. I think it's an anti-religion thing, it's movement now. It may get worse, it may get better. I don't know. We'll just trust the Lord and keep going. All I know is, excuse me tonight, as far as this church is concerned, I will do my part. And I think that's what each of us will do. As long as we do that, the church will stay here as long as it stays. And the Lord will bless us in what we do. He's never looked at numbers. Humans look at numbers, oh, look at there what they did. I think before we moved here with L.D. Webb, I think they had a Bible school here of 400 one time. I heard that for a good while since I got here, and I thought, big deal, 400. I think they said they borrowed people from every congregation in town to get 400. And that's about what you do sometimes when you have those goals. Some people really goal-oriented. I'm not that way too much. I'm an old farmer. I plant the seeds, and what you get is what you plant. And I think that's the way the kingdom grows. You plant the seed, the kingdom will grow as it's supposed to grow. It may not grow like you think it should. It may not grow like I think it should. It may have things wrong with it I think's wrong with it. It may not be wrong with it. And it may have assets that I don't even know about. So I think the biggest thing and the best thing to do when you're serving the Lord, no matter where you are. Now, I've been in small congregations. I worshiped as a boy with 20 members, and that's me and my 3 cousins did all the services. One of us preached, 2 of us waited on the table, 1 led singing. I'm thankful we did that. I was just as happy in 20 as I am in 5,000. So I'm happy wherever the Lord's people meet together, and what they do the work, as long as they're faithful, want the Word of God preached and want to try to live it, they're my people. And that's the way I feel about it. Well, an invitation, of course, is offered at the close of each service. This has not been conducive to teaching of the gospel or anything of that sort, but I always like to be the door open for anybody that needs to become a Christian or needs prayers or help in any way. That's what the invitation song is all about. So Eric will lead us in a song. We'll stand and we'll sing.